Hi everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of Straight Talk with Bren O'Brien and Tim Rowe from The Straight, brought to you by our sponsors, Darley and Inglis. Today, we chat about the lure of international horses to Australia, how a political decision in another code in Australia's smallest state might have broader implications and concerns for the thoroughbred industry, questions over a ministerial review. We chat to Darley's Alastair Pulford about the upcoming breeding season, too darn hot and the expectations of a new Godolphin era. Andrew Hore-Lacy makes his mark at TBA and Aushorse, and in wagering, contrasting fortunes for two of Australia's biggest bookies. Tim, we'll kick off with a timely yarn. A lot of discussion this week about international horses coming to Australia, including one from your good self in Rowe on Monday earlier in the week involving a Japanese star possibly coming for the Everest.
Yes, Invincible Pupper, a Shalar sprinter that was actually, Shalar bred here at Arrowfield and sold at Easter, bought by the Japanese, and they've bought quite a few Southern Hemisphere bred horses and taken them back to Japan. Obviously, Home Affairs Sunlight filly this year's gone to Japan, but he looks quite good. Invincible Puffer won on the turf on Sunday. How he stacks up, I'm not across the Japanese form, but when you look at the Everest, outside Kaying Rising, Private Harry, Briaso's taken. Who do you go to? He's an X Factor sprinter. Who's to say he can't give some cheek? And Inglis is an English graduate. Inglis this year are back in the fold, I believe, looking for a horse rather than they leased it out the last couple of years to Entain and NZ Tap. So, they look preferably a English graduate, and he potentially could fit the bill. And I'm told that possibly some other partners might be willing to sort of go in with Inglis, whether it's in their interest to do that. But I know there's certainly some talks behind the scenes, possibly that, maybe Inglis could de-risk with some partners there on the slot this year.
Yep, interesting. One of course, we've got a Japanese runner confirmed for the Golden Eagle this week, Panjatawa, and you chatted with Navesh Ramdani last week, and you've also been chatting with Paul Bloodworth, who does the recruitment for Racing Victoria and does a lot of travel as well. I mean, there's an article up in the Straight at the moment. What did you learn out of that, Tim? What did you learn out of sort of how these guys are going about their business of recruiting international horses and why it has become more important?
Well, I guess, as I was up there only a couple of weeks ago, and Adrian Beaumont from International Racing Bureau, who's sort of contracted on a retainer to the ATC, Racing Victoria, pretty much nearly every jurisdiction around the world. Probably previously with the Melbourne Cup, it was about lifting the profile and things like that. But just with the advent of World Pool and the international wagering appeal of these races, it's worth a lot of money to jurisdictions to have international competition that will encourage their local punters or other punters to bet on, in this case, Golden Eagles and Australian races. And the other interesting thing is, I think, as Peter V'landys has told The Straight previously, the Golden Eagle deserves to be a Group 1. Even the most ardent critic would argue, it probably should be a Group 1, and that would allow it to possibly at least campaign and press to be included on the World Pool calendar, which would be worth a lot of money and possibly try and then pay for itself. It is, a $10 million race, a lot of money. So that's, I think, now why the ATC, all that funding also, the tote World Pool funding goes directly to the ATC as opposed to Racing New South Wales. And I know, Bren, you've reported previously that Kaying Rising could be worth $1 million to the ATC. Navesh did suggest that may be a touch high, but I guess it depends how parochial the Hong Kong punters are come, Everest Day and, how they want to support their local superstar.
What is interesting around this stuff is obviously if you're bringing the Golden Eagle as a World Pool meeting, it's obviously the same day as Victorian Derby, which is already a World Pool meeting as it is. So whether they then combine those meetings, probably similar to what they've done with the Everest and the Caulfield Cup over time. It does change things around a bit, has changed their priorities. So it is a very interesting time. I guess back in the 90s, we saw, international expansion and going to recruit these international horses as an exercise in, I guess, growing the profile of a race like the Melbourne Cup. But it's not about that as much anymore, because if you can get more people and more eyeballs on your products from a wagering perspective, then there's value in that, both from the PRA point of view and the club point of view as well. News this week out of Tassie about the greyhound ban. It broke on Saturday night. There's a question about relevance it has to the thoroughbred industry. Obviously I penned a column on Sunday talking about really it should send a shiver across all racing codes about the dangers of politics and racing. because this decision has sort of come out of nowhere 3 weeks ago. A little over 3 weeks ago, just before he went to the polls, Jeremy Rockcliffe sent a letter around to participants in the greyhound racing industry saying he's the Premier of Tasmania, was very committed to the future of all three codes. And 3 weeks later, he said they're going to wind up greyhound racing effectively by 2029 by pulling the plug on $7.5 million of government funding, which highly unlikely that greyhound racing can exist within that. What it does say beyond the greyhound aspect is that there obviously are people out there, Tim, and we know there are people out there that are got a stated objective to end racing of all forms, and they want to end racing, and that's their democratic right to express that view and go and gather the support that they need around that. I disagree with those people clearly, but I don't disagree with the fact that they've got the right to put their view forward. In this situation, they've done a very good job of leveraging their political heft and got themselves in the right room at the right time in order to negotiate their way into a position of strength and effectively in greyhound racing. Who's to say in 10, 15 years' time, Tim, we're not having a similar conversation about horse racing and suddenly it becomes a public campaign? Because there are people who are heavily against horse racing. And regardless of the fact it's a big industry or whatever else, Tas Racing estimated greyhound racing was worth about $50 million to $60 million to the Tasmanian economy. Well, that hasn't meant much, has it? It's in a space of a minute's notice. They will lose a code, and it becomes a game of increments. And those who are in that position where they want to see the end of competitive animals and sports and stuff like that, they see it as cruel, for right or for wrong. And I'd say it's probably wrong. They now have a blueprint which they can go to town on. So for me, it's a concern, Tim. I know you hold similar sort of ideas that the thoroughbred industry can't afford to sit on their hands on this, because I know a few people I've spoken to are like, oh, well, it's only the dogs in Tassie. Why would we care? For me, there's the implications of it extend far beyond that.
I've got a bit more question to you. I was, I'm New South Wales, and so I was around and felt compelled at the time to write to my local member about when New South Wales, Mike Baird and the coalition ran through a ban on greyhound racing, and our esteemed member at the time, Darryl Maguire, now disgraced, was probably rather feathering his own nest, and he spoke out against, calling for a ban on greyhound racing. Good on you, Darryl. Is there a chance that swell of support for greyhound racing or anti-government could occur in Tassie, or is the political machinations just too different to New South Wales, what played out here?
I think that the challenge for that is that there was a clear wedge in New South Wales between Nationals and Liberals, which sort of was able to create a political wedge to be able to utilise that. I'm trying to sort of think back to that situation. And this situation, Liberals got 14 seats. They need 18 to rule, and they need the support of the independents to actually get into power and maintain power. And that's the reality of it. There's been no one in the Liberal Party that's come out and said much. The Labor Party have said very little about this, apart from the fact they don't agree with it. Dean Winter, the opposition leader, is an avid supporter of racing, all three codes. The only person that's come out and said something about it has been the shooters and fishers guy that got in, probably quite surprisingly. So I think from a political point of view, there's not a lot here, but I think because it's a 4-year process, there is an opportunity to have a little bit more of a groundswell and bring that back. Now, as I said, whether you believe greyhound racing needs to clean up its act, needs to work through things or whatever else, that's fine. But then the other thing too, Tim, just to put into this, and I'm going to put a bit of a bow around this after that because we don't want to talk about this all day. But what is significant about this is some of the concerns or a significant amount of concerns raised about greyhound racing in Tasmania has been around about integrity and the integrity function. That is blatantly the fault of the current government, who botched the entire integrity review over the space of 4 or 5 years and finally got something through in the last 12 months. So the reason why they weren't able to was a very publicised case about a leading trainer, and the reason why he was able to wriggle his way out of that net partially was because of the inefficiencies of a integrity system that was not designed properly and was not executed properly. So in the end, the greyhound industry has suffered for the fact that the government haven't probably done their job on this. And that concerns me. And it speaks more broadly to the fact, and I'll now hook this around another issue, Tim. This speaks more broadly to the fact that the government participation in racing needs to be well-intentioned, but also well-educated. And the question around that then hooks into what's gone on in New South Wales, where we've had a review of the Thoroughbred Racing Act announced last week, with Brad Hazzard, the former health minister, put forward as the man who's going to oversee that. All good and well. But unless you get those reviews right, there's significant concerns or significant challenges to actually get the right result out of that. Because, as pointed out by Hamish Esplin on the Straight earlier this week, one of the aspects of the thoroughbred racing review in New South Wales which was not being dealt with, which is deliberately said this is not in scope, is the future funding of racing. And that is at the heart of all the challenges of racing. And what do we talk about all the time about the challenges of racing, Tim? It comes back to wagering, it comes back to the way the sport's funded, it comes back to distribution of funds. And for me, I am concerned that in New South Wales, they are going down a similar path where they'll get a review up, but in 5 or 6 years' time, when, let's face it, things are in a bad spot, they'll sit there and go to the racing industry, well, you stuffed this up. Well, it's arguable to say that the government stuffed this up when they weren't broad enough in their scope to actually go and look at what this Racing Act does and why it's no longer fit for purpose in 2025.
Yes, I agree with that, Bren. And look, but in 5 or 6 years' time, maybe Peter V'landys is not there, and a new person comes in with new perspectives. But this is the government's chance. They don't have to enact all the recommendations or anything like that, but at least those advocating for this review, at least examine everything and see what's out there. And I've been getting the calls as you have, Bren, about this is the dissatisfaction of part of this is it's not broad enough because they're just not examining everything. And, as the Rosehill inquiry showed, there is a lot of dissatisfaction out there. And, Peter V'landys has his critics and he'll stand firm on what he believes in. But still, from a government perspective or inquiry perspective, they arguably should be able to examine everything. And as I said, they don't have to enact everything, just at least examine it.
Yes, and speaking of Peter V'landys' critics, Mark Latham, probably Peter V'landys' most vocal critic over the past couple of years, has found himself on the opposite side of the ledger there. He's been called before racing New South Wales stewards, and an interesting development over his run-in with Steve McMahon of the ATC on at a Rosehill meeting back in April. Now, we'll sort of, I won't go into it in detail, Tim, but it is very interesting. Mark Latham will probably be one of those politicians that want to see more things put on the table around this review. It's interesting. He now finds himself answering to the Racing New South Wales stewards as a registered participant because of his role as an owner. So anyway, it's funny how these things work out. But the politics of this game can be brutal, but at the heart of it is an industry that needs to thrive. And if politics is not serving that, then it needs to be fixed. The following segment is brought to you by Inglis. Entries have opened for the Inglis Digital August Late Online Sale. Inglis had a run of extraordinarily successful digital sales of late, including a $1.625 million result for Velocious, while in the just completed early August sale, Cleo Cat sold for $355,000 and Yellow Sam for $305,000. A reminder also that entries for the 2026 Inglis Select Yearling Sale Series close on Friday, August 15. There will again be 4 yearling sales in Inglis next year: Classic, Premier, Easter and HTVA. Go to english.com.au for all the details. And joining us on Straight Talk is Alastair Pulford, Head of Sales at Darley Stallions. Alastair, we are very close to the start of the stallion season, start of the breeding season. How have dominations been travelling to this point of the season for the suite of Darley Stallions?
We're actually going really well. We're blessed this year with a roster that's got quite a few stars in it. And what happens, we found that when you're doing business with people who want to get into horses like, Two Don Hot or Animo or Traffic Warden or Broadsiding for, or any of those, Harry Angel, it pulls in more business. So whilst there has been talk that studs are slow, I think there was an article in one of the papers the other day that bookings have been slow. We're not finding that. We're certainly, we're well ahead of where we were this time last year, but we had a reasonably tough year last year. But this year we're going super. We're flying. Very happy. So we've got, horses, as I mentioned, Two Don Hot fully booked, Animo fully booked, Broadsiding fully booked, Harry Angel fully booked, Traffic Warden fully booked, and Bivouac very popular, Pinatubo increasing in popularity, Cylinder going really well second year, Native Trail going okay second year. So Street Boss doesn't have to cover a big book and he's nearly at his limit. So we're very, very positive at this stage. It's looking good.
I'll jump in on that question. Obviously, you've got a couple of new additions to the team in Broadsiding and Traffic Warden, as you mentioned. What's the opportunity there for breeders, you think, with those stallions and those two respective young stallions?
Well, Broadsiding's the most expensive first season sire in Australia this year, and justifiably so. Obviously, he was champion 2-year-old I'm sure he'll be champion 3-year-old from the season just finished, 4-time Group 1 winner, really top horse, and by the sire of the moment in Two Down Hot. So he's got a lot going for him. He's out of a street crime mare, so he's got that in his advantage too. So yeah, he's got plenty going for him. He's great looking. He had that 2-year-old ability that everyone looks for, but he obviously extended that out as a 3-year-old. He's pretty easy to mate to. Yeah, he's a lovely looking horse, quite a lot like his father in many respects. So he's an easy horse to mate to, and yeah, he's been very popular since we announced him. Traffic Warden, likewise, who just lived in his shadow in the racing stable slightly, particularly in the Golden Rose when he was nutted by, not very much. It was probably, 20 or 30 centimeters. But he's By Street Boss, who just keeps doing it for us. He's been such a great stallion for us. Obviously, Animo leads the way, and then Tenterus and Tempted this season. But Traffic Warden, early on he was the number 1 seed for the stable, and he ran in the Golden Slipper and the Sire's Produce. He ran very well in them. He was a multiple Group 2 winner, just failed in 2 Group 1s. So he was a proper racehorse. He's out of an exceed and sell mare from one of our great families. So he's been very popular too. And the more people get to see him, the more he filled up. We have closed his book now, but it took probably a few weeks longer, probably a month or 2 longer than Broadsiding did.
Yeah. And obviously, we could talk about Broadsiding. Two Down Hot returns being highly anticipated. Has the quality of mares you've booked in matched your expectation? Obviously, there's a significant mare already booked in, but beyond Winks, what's the sort of expectation that the quality of book is? It sort of match where you thought it would be?
Absolutely. Obviously, when you're standing at 250,000 plus GST, 275 grand, you need to have a good mare to do that. We've limited his book to 100 mares going into the season, and that so all the top breeders really wanted access to him. We sort of took submissions for mares and approved. So we had some say in that. I don't say we try and tell breeders how to breed their mares, but when you're limited, we were quite particular on the level of mare that we did accept to him, but in any case, it's a natural thing because he stands for enough money that people want to send their best mares.
And Alastair, you got me now?
Yep.
Yeah, we have got you now. You're in now too.
Yeah, excellent. So I don't play around with technology. What sort of mares or what best mares are heading to Two Down Hot? Is your pedigree or type? Is there a physical sort of?
It's probably reasonably well documented. Two Down Hot's not a great big burly horse himself. He's a beautifully refined, certainly was as a racehorse. He's put on a bit of weight now that he's a stallion, but he's a lovely refined quality thoroughbred, very elegant horse, very elegant moving horse. So I think people probably send him bigger mares because they know he'll neaten them up, but I think he's just getting just high quality. They don't need to be big to be great runners. Broadsiding is very much like his father, who's 15-3 hands, just a beautiful type of horse. None of these top horses that he's throwing are really big monsters. That's not what you get with Two Down Hot. It's not what you want with Two Down Hot. You want something that's quick and lightning on his feet like he was. I remember John Gosden described him as a Ferrari McLaren type. That's the sort of horse he is. He's not a big Mack truck.
And some of those high profile Godolphin mares, who are you sending?
We're really buttering up this year. So names that you will know well: In Secret, obviously multiple Group 1 winner; Elise, multiple Group 1 winner; Flit, 1,000 Guineas winner; Circular, who's the dam of Cylinder. Who else is there? Just Savatiano, Willowy, Zapateo; Transfers, the dam of Tom Kitten; Paracel is a stakes winning Astern mare; Liar, the Blue Diamond winner; Larkspur Run, she's a stakes winning Shamadal mare; Heresy, stakes winning Street Boss mares; Hellfest, stakes winning Fastnet Rock mare. It's a good group. It's as good a group of mares as we'd have ever sent a stallion, I would imagine. It's an absolute it's something else really.
And sort of I was going to say a measure of his appeal, and that is that you've auctioning off a nomination to him in support of the Catwalk Spinal Cord Injury Trust. Alastair, talk us through that. What's the idea there, and what are you sort of hoping, obviously, to create a bit of a goodwill and good charity around this very good cause?
Yeah, I mean, look, Catwalk, for anyone who knows Katrina Williams, she's an absolutely remarkable human being. So Catwalk was founded by her. Katrina Williams is the wife of Sam Williams, who's Little Avondale stud in New Zealand. She had a terrible accident in 2002 and injured her spine and has been in a wheelchair ever since. And she, soon after her injury, she started this foundation, Catwalk, which is about, it's about spinal cord injury research. So it's not, it's a fantastic charity for getting people from all walks of life who have these spinal cord injuries and are on a wheelchair bound. And it's about putting research money into that, because they're getting closer and closer to a solution or a cure or whatever you want to call it. But it costs a lot of money, and there's some unbelievable work going on around the world, and that work needs funding. It doesn't come for nothing. So being in the horse business, sure, certainly I know enough people that have injured themselves or are in that predicament. But it's not only the horse business. It's anyone. I've been and attended many catwalk functions in the past, and their stories are absolutely inspirational. The people behind it are inspirational, and it's an amazing charity for a extremely worthwhile cause. So Katrina, we have a great relationship with her. Godolphin have a great relationship with Catwalk, but so do Watership Down, the part owners of Too Darn Hot, and Madeline Lloyd Webber, who's the principal of Watership Down, along with her husband Lloyd Webber, is a former international eventer herself, so she knows what it's like, and she's got no doubt knows people in that same sort of situation. So she's very close to it as well. This isn't the first occasion the Too Darn Hot has donated to Catwalk. We did auction off a service to him in his first or second year at Studder, I remember, but this is a whole different ball game. So now he's standing at a huge amount of money. He's absolutely fully booked going into the season. With his 100 mares, this will be number 101, and I imagine that the people who've supported Catwalk throughout the industry have been fantastic over the years. There's some great stories behind it, and it just it feeds on itself really. And look, the aim is to get these people in wheelchairs back on their feet, and let's hope this in some way gets them closer to that goal.
Yeah, and of course that'll be part of the Inglis Digital August late online sale. Inglis, another fabulous sponsor of this podcast, along with Darley. So an excellent initiative involving collaboration between Godolphin, Watership Down, and Catwalk, as you said.
And I would certainly encourage it will be lot one in that late August sale. So just everyone pay attention to that and make sure that you obviously want to have a nice mare to go to him, but I think it's an extremely worthwhile cause. It's 100% of the proceeds will be going to charity, so it's very, very worthwhile.
Just one other aspect I wanted to touch on, Alastair, is a new era for Godolphin from a racing sense with a move to a public training model. It's been a terrific start with winners to date with a host of new trainers. We've had Chris Waller, we've had Tony and Kelvin McAvoy, we have Michael Friedman. I mean, it must be pleasing from a perspective. Obviously, there's a little bit of what now when you have a change of model, but must be pleasing within the walls there to see things sort of kick off so well.
Absolutely, it's great. And look, obviously, I'm mainly looking at it from the stallion's point of view, and I suppose the difference between having a private and a public training model is just the access to more public trainers. So the more public trainers have our horses, obviously that is the better that is for our stallion brand. And when Chris Waller or Tony McAvoy or Björn Baker or whoever it might be are winning races with the progeny of our stallions, that's going to improve their perspective of those stallions, and hopefully they go to the yearling sales and purchase more of those from some of our clients, because our policy is still that we don't sell yearlings, we still race everything we breed. So we're not taking on our clients in the sales ring, so to speak, but we are, hopefully in some way this helps promote the stallion business. So yeah, it's been a great start. Let's hope it continues.
Alastair, from a Darley perspective, your roster's looking very good at the moment. A lot of young sires coming through, but you're always looking for the next crop of young stallions. You've got some nice young colts that have been dispersed through. Who are you looking forward to seeing sort of produce during the spring and hopefully into the autumn?
Well, our exciting 2-year-olds from the autumn were obviously bivouacked by Bivouac, Group 2 winner. He's now with Chris Waller. He's a very, very exciting horse. I think I know that the Cummings team, when they had him, thought the world of him. He won the Silver Slipper. Things didn't quite go his way after that, but I think he's got oodles and oodles of talent. So let's hope he can take the next step and win in Group 1 company. And of course Tentris, who was so impressive winning the Tottenham Stakes and unfortunately injured himself in that race and couldn't go on to the Slipper. But very, very high class street boss colt. So those are the two obvious ones. Those are the two that I've identified themselves so far. But who knows what's in the wings? There's plenty of horses in training, so something might jump out of the ground too. They don't always announce themselves as 2-year-olds.
Well, even Hawkesbury on Tuesday, I hope I'm Invincible colt only won a Hawkesbury maiden, but he could be one to progress through. I don't know where the aims are, but probably gets further than the 1100 he won over.
Yeah, absolutely, and he looked very good, winning, didn't he? So let's hope, he can produce to that high, that highest level, because really to become stallions, they have to win at a pretty good level these days.
Alastair, thank you so much for your time. Always good to catch up, and all the best for the breeding season. We'll catch you at the stallion parades next week.
No worries, I'm looking forward to it.
And Tim, just one other thing to touch on from the bloodstock industry after that extensive chat with Alastair. Andrew Hore-Lacy, CEO of Thoroughbred Breeders Australia and Aushorse, announcing a new look team this week. A couple of names we're quite familiar with, Tim, but clearly, Andrew's really clear to make this role his own. He's brought in Leanna Packard, who we know quite well from Newgate. She's the head of marketing and partnerships. Megan McGrath, who's at Victoria Racing Club, is now the head of advocacy and communications. And two people that have worked existently with the organisation. Maddie Timms, we know very well. Madison Timms is brilliant at her job. I went to a couple of her sessions earlier this year and helped out talking to a couple of their graduate programs around about media and stuff. And Maddie does an absolutely sensational job in education and projects. So it's good to see her getting the support that she needs within that. And Jemmy Cameron, someone who's close to her own heart's now the head of finance and administration. But you get a feeling that the nature of the role, and the previous person in the role had a very strong presence, Tom Riley, but that Andrew's going to create this, develop this organisation to stamp himself very much on how he wants to run it, Tim.
Absolutely. And there's, all those people you mentioned got from, as you said, from my experience, huge work ethics, as you say, with Maddie Timms and, Leanna Packard. She's been integral under sort of Henry Field, the growth of Newgate for the last, I'm not sure when she started exactly at Newgate, but certainly the last 5 to 8 years, huge growth at Newgate, and she's been pivotal to that. So TBA and Aushorse, it's a small organisation that cover a lot of ground or a lot of different things. So you do need a work ethic, and Andrew's brought in some good people that I'm sure will be able to take it to the next level and keep doing what they're doing and more.
In the wagering world now, Tim, interesting sort of contrast. The two biggest players in global wagering, Entain and Flutter, announced their half-year results over the last week. Flutter last week announcing, things are relatively positive from their perspective. What is significant is Sportsbet returned to year-on-year revenue growth after a little bit of the Australian wagering landscape's been a little bit rocky the last couple of years, as we've spoken about. Things are looking a little bit more positive at the moment. Obviously, Flutter's flying because the American market's driving a lot of the growth, but things are now looking a lot more positive. I think it's 3% growth in revenue for Sportsbet. Their turnover has dropped, but effectively it's dropped about 6% year on year compared to the first half last year. But Australian customers were spending less, but Sportsbet was generating more revenue from those customers, and that mirrors what we're seeing elsewhere. Entain, on the other hand, really strong international results. Great results in New Zealand. Obviously, they've driven 12% growth year on year. It's the NZ tab and the a Betcha brand, which is 18% growth on the online market. And obviously they've now got the effectively the legislative net, which gives them a virtual monopoly within New Zealand, which didn't kick in until the 28th of June. So the next half, be really interested to see how that goes. But from an Australian perspective, there's still a few questions around, I guess. 7% down on net gaming revenue year on year. There's an article up in the Straight which sort of details how, a few years ago it was, the growth centre of entertainment was driven by Australia, and that's post-pandemic and pandemic wagering boom. And now Australia is one of the few markets that's not growing. But Entain are committed to the Australian market. They'll continue to drive those, what they're doing in the Australian market. But obviously they've got to get through this not so little issue about the AusTrack action as well. But really important to have, the bigger players in the Australian market in good health and continuing to post good results. In that regard, it was a positive for the industry to see Sportsbet do well. Entain does need to bounce back, but you get the feeling, Tim, that the strength of brand and product that they've already put into space will serve them well longer term. And Tim, another interesting aspect is this increase in minimum bet limits in New Zealand. Obviously, we've seen NBLs become a big part of the Australian market, and I guess there's always a bit of a concern about them not being enforced the way they should. But some positive steps in New Zealand by the look of things, which will please our good mate Michael Gearan, no doubt, who spoke about NBLs on his program a little while back and the importance of New Zealand punters in an environment where they can't bet externally to be able to make sure they can get the bets they want on.
But on Wednesday, it was confirmed, and they in effect today, that certainly, punters on a Saturday, Kiwi punters could get on to win 5,000 with NZ Tab through their accounts, and plus Betcha. So if it's 1,000, so effectively to get on to win 6,000, which is not a bad bet. I'm sure there's some that would want more, but that's a very small percentage. And I think even sports betting NBLs, which aren't in place here, harness racing on a Friday night can get on to win 5,000. Even, there's a lot of Kiwi punters that like betting on Australian racing, obviously. They can pretty much match the Australian NBLs with $1,000 and $2,000. So, they're going to be able to get a reasonable bet on. Not won't serve everyone, but at least genuine NBLs. I think just it's good for the New Zealand industry to have that certainty from a punter's perspective and confidence to be able to bet if they wanted to have a decent bet to win a reasonable amount. Yeah,
and I guess the reality is if you're only dealing with one company and two brands, enforcing those NBLs is probably a lot easier as well because you're only dealing with one lot of people. So I think that's important from that perspective. There might be a few Australians looking to get a Kiwi passport, Tim. We've got to go to a news section now on Straight Talk. Shout out to Talia, who does our recording and our production stuff here. She's been organising a few questions to push out online and people to come back to questions to Tim and I, which we'll attempt to answer from our audience. So we've got, I think, 3 or 4 questions to have a look over here, Tim. First one to you, Tim, and this is from it comes from Will Johnson, actually, again, another friend of the program. Do Australian training methods get the best out of horses? Japan and Europe clearly do things differently for seemingly far superior results at the highest level. No, that actually wasn't from Will Johnson. I must correct that. That's from someone else. But he asked if Australian training methods get the best out of horses, Tim.
Well, I'll frame it this way. The facilities, as I keep saying, having been a new market and what people have shown me, I've seen in Japan and saw some vision this week from Shanti. It's just very different with the staffing levels. In Australia, most trainers, not all, there's, Lindsay Parks and a few, and Kieran Maher's got facilities, but for the most part, they're trained on course, limited staff or track riders shortages. They're in and out, probably every half an hour. They can't spend 2 hours on horseback, just long, slow work, which develops stayers, I guess. That it's just a different game, and you can argue Australians, supposedly the best sprinters in the world, and part of that would be the facilities and the way they train is shorter, sharper work. But in England, some of those a trainer that has 100 horses in work might only send out 3 or 4 strings, so to speak. So that's 4 trips over 6 or 7 hours. That's just not possible in Australia. It has to be shorter, sharper work because of the labour force and just track shut at 9 o'clock in the morning. Ballarat might be a bit later, but even Caulfield back when it was open, I think it was shutting at 8 or 8:30. So limited time to get your horses worked. And I think it's more to do with facilities and the environment rather than actual trainers, so to speak.
Yeah, and I'd probably argue that too, that the results, to say that they get more superior results in Japan and Europe, Japan's different, and they do travel, but they do have an elite system there, which is, the structure of the system is a lot different as opposed to the structure of the training system. I'd argue that Australia punches above its weight, certainly when it comes to sprinters and the horses that we're good at. Anyway, this one is from Will Johnson. What is the potential reason and consequence of the significant drop in Caulfield Cup and Cox Plate nominations? Or is it just a yearly anomaly? That's Tim, I'll let you answer that because you've had a chat with Paul Bloodworth, as I mentioned, in the last couple of days.
Well, for some background, I'm sure anyone listening to this would know that most Victoria brought in, pretty stringent veterinary rules, and they've changed them a little bit this year, make it a little bit easier for imports. But, in Aidan O'Brien's case, I think he nominated 19 horses for the Caulfield Cup and Cox Plate last year. He's nominated 4 this year. It's just, I think trainers are being smart about which horses they think will suit rather than just nominating a whole team of them. Even in Australia, it costs money to nominate these horses at a time when it does cost a lot of money to have a horse in work. I think trainers are being smarter and not passing that cost on when realistically they're not going to be running anywhere, in those big races. So I'm not saying it's an anomaly. I'd say to be sort of ongoing, but more of the horses nominated are probably a greater chance of running in those races. That's what I'd put it down to. Time will tell if I'm right, but that's my assumption at this stage.
Yeah, there's less of those sort of optimistic roll of the dice types now that are just sort of throwing in a nom for a horse that probably doesn't know how they're getting there. The next question, probably best that I answer, is about how many racehorses are currently registered in Tasmania? What's the figure, say, 10 years ago? Is there a decline? How many registered trainers, jockeys? How do participants survive? How many meetings compared now? Okay, so what I'll say is that hasn't been a significant downturn in Tasmanian racing in terms of numbers over that time. The amount of meetings hasn't changed greatly. Prize money's gone up, turnover's gone up. So there's argument to say that probably the challenge in Tasmanian racing is probably, there's a couple of aspects. One's the fact is the amount of horses being bred in Tasmania has dropped significantly. And we're talking from around about 500 a year to I think 290 last year, Tim, which was a lot less. So that's a concern from that perspective. Your foal crop drops down. So therefore there's a lot of horses coming from interstate through digital platforms in order being sold down here to race. So that's part of the challenge they've got, is how you structure your racing to best maximise that and longer term. But the broader challenge they've got, Tasmanian racing industry is responsible for about $190 million in expenditure across Tasmania. Over $100 million that comes from the thoroughbred industry. It is a very valuable industry. We've seen this week that doesn't ever count for much, but the reality is things are relatively healthy. Certainly from an integrity perspective, things are a lot better than where they were. A lot of the jockeys still fly in, fly out, which is not ideal. There's always challenges around staff and those things as well. But as a rule, things are relatively, they're not as bad as some may lead you to believe around when Tasmanian racing is at. The challenge is to make sure that breeding industry is strong. I believe there'll be a series of announcements in the next couple of weeks, which will be a significant boost to that, as well as various other sort of platforms and looking to support Tassie racing. Tas racing are working very hard to fix a lot of the issues that they've got. I don't believe that Tasmanian racing is any more danger than any other industry around Australia. However, it's walking on a thinner tightrope. So that's probably part of the challenge. As we've seen, the politics can play out where they are. Tim, on to the next question now. Is Rosehill on the verge of being phased out by Racing New South Wales due to the non-sale by ATC members and the relocation of the Golden Eagle?
Funny how things work. They announced it on Friday that it's going to Randwick, and Randwick's washed out on Saturday. It's just sometimes you can't make these things up. They've invested a lot of money in Randwick. They say it attracts bigger crowds, and it probably does, catering wise and all of that. The club probably makes more money out of it, but it comes down to, the amount of money spent on marketing as well, on the Everest and different things like that. Sydney still needs Rosehill. They need it. Randwick can't sustain the extra number of meetings that Rosehill hosts. It's in my opinion, a good betting track. So, yeah, in the short to medium term, I can't see any changes. They might, as I said, feature spring and autumn races. Probably, they'll want them at Randwick. But as a whole, Rosehill is a very important part of the Sydney racing ecosystem and will remain that way for the foreseeable future, I think.
Yeah, and I don't know what the precise terms around this, but it's fair to say that the Golden Eagle is a Racing New South Wales race and the Golden Slipper remains an ATC event. So the ATC will have the rights around that and where that sits. the Golden Eagle move been mooted for a while now. It's just sort of interesting to see how that plays out. A final question, which I'll get on to, Tim. Will any race club disclose any net revenue from Whirlpool? Thank you to Jason Cornell for that comment. My answer to that question would be, it's very hard to find anything about where a lot of this revenue comes from. And some of the clubs are more transparent than others. Consistency would be awesome. From a PRA perspective, there's one PRA in particular that's very opaque around about the wagering numbers. It's very difficult to access exactly where that wagering number's coming from and breaking it down, which makes it difficult as well. So I'm all for more transparency. A, it makes my job easier. B, it's good for the industry. But your point is well taken, Jason, around that. Okay, thanks for joining us on Straight Talk, brought to you by Inglis and Darley, our fabulous sponsors. Don't forget to give us a rating wherever you're listening to us. And be sure to subscribe. Send us an email as well at editor@thestraight.com.au or any of our social media channels. Ask us a question for next week. Yep, and we'll talk to you again next week. Thanks for your time.